Educational Communications and this station present Environmental Directions with Nancy Pearlman. On this series, we explore the effects of human influence on the Earth's ecosystems and discuss solutions to environmental problems which affect the quality of life on this planet. Environmental Directions gives you the kind of information you need to help you participate in decisions impacting your community, the nation, and the world. Now, here's your host, Nancy Pearlman.
Hello. For the next half hour, we are going to be talking about energy use, especially with indoor agriculture, with my guest, Evan Mills. He is a retired senior scientist with the United States Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and is a research affiliate with the Energy and Resources Group of the College of Natural Resources at the University of California at Berkeley, and is a principal with his consultancy, Energy Associates. He has also been a visiting researcher at Lund University in Sweden, and he was senior author with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize with former United States Vice President Al Gore. He has also been a past leader of the laboratory's Center for Building Science, which represented the work of about 400 people, and has been assistant director of the Energy and Environment Division. He has published over 377 articles and reports in his fields of interest, including contributions to over 17 books and 86 peer-reviewed journal articles. He has also served on a federal advisory committee that produced the United States Global Climate Change Research Program's third national assessment entitled Global Climate Change Impacts in the United States. Welcome. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Great to be with you, Nancy.
Last time you talked about some of the need to tackle our energy crisis, which is part of our climate crisis, which is part of our environmental crisis. And of course, you are still very involved with that. But what I find most interesting is how you have now decided to focus on indoor agriculture and its energy use. It's most fascinating because agriculture is a massive energy user. Is it better to have agriculture outdoors or in greenhouses?
No question, outdoors if the concern is energy. The indoor ag is using vastly more energy than open field. They like to call it open field agriculture.
But it has become more common to do indoor agriculture greenhouses that actually don't even have windows. And of course, that means they need lighting. That means they need energy. But it's only about 1% of agriculture at this moment?
Yeah, it's only about 1% of U.S. food production. Remarkably, it's half of all the energy used in U.S. agriculture. Gives you a sense of how much more energy intensive it is.
You have done a lot of independent research, did a meta-analysis of 116 studies that spans 40 countries and Antarctica, of all places, 23 crop types. What were some of the discoveries about this new kind of agriculture, which you actually use a term plant factories?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different types of contexts, right, in which this practice happens. There are plant factories, which are the most, let's say, artificial environments. They have no windows, they have no sunlight, they have no wind, they have no rain, they even have no soil because the food is grown in artificial growing media. Then there are greenhouses, as you mentioned, which have some amount of solar light. Remarkably, even greenhouses in the industrial application still will have electric lighting. Sometimes they have air conditioning, but greenhouses are generally using somewhat less energy because they do have a contribution from the sun. And then there are, of course, light greenhouses. Most people, when they think about a greenhouse, they think about a light structure with glass or plastic over it without any electricity going in. And those do exist, but in the industrial production of food at large scales, greenhouses themselves are very industrialized spaces, very energy-intensive spaces. You mentioned it's new, and it's new on the one hand, but it also is quite old. The challenge of agriculture has always been, or among the challenges are hazards. to food production. So this could be insects, could be weather, could be fire, could be thievery. So the idea of having food, sometimes they call it protected ag. It's indoors in some way to extend the growing season, to guard against pests and hailstorms and things of that sort. So it is an old idea. It actually traces back to the Romans. The Emperor Tiberius at the time of Christ, his doctor convinced him he needed to eat a very particular kind of melon. He wanted to eat it all year, and so they took slabs of translucent stone and built a structure that worked, we would call a modern greenhouse. And then in North Korea in the 1400s, they had these sheltered facilities that used waxed or oiled mulberry paper to let in light, and they burned wood, and they had hollow cores in the floors to take the heat of kind of like adobe buildings. It's an old idea. It's been done for a long time. Those are much less energy intensive. In the 1960s, there was a big romance with this in the modern context, even in the 1800s, actually, when electric lighting came, mostly in Northern Europe and the Soviet realm. There were electrically lit greenhouses. In Poland, they started to do the first plant factories. These were multi-story, fantastical, space-age kind of structures that used remarkable amounts of energy. But it's only in recent years that it's become a large industrial activity that's really been pushing up energy use. And there's a lot of pressure, a lot of market pressure to do more and more of this, a lot of investment. Billions and billions of dollars have come into this industry around the world to build these crazy facilities that are big environmental behemoths.
As you say, greenhouses are not new. They've been around for centuries. Agriculture, of course, was basically a concept that developed about 10,000 years ago, although it could go back even further, that people were handling crops and planting trees and coming back to them. So raising food is more ancient than we like to think, but most of it was outdoors. As you're pointing out, greenhouses are very energy consumptive, but there's some places where you really basically need a greenhouse. Antarctica, the space station.
Yeah, a lot of the research actually on this was done by NASA, other entities. You mentioned a few of them, also submarine life. They wanted people to be in subs, but that's all fine, right? These are, from an energy and climate change standpoint, those are small numbers of facilities. There's no aggregate concern about how much energy they may or may not use. But you've also got parts of the world. Norway grows 100% of its tomatoes indoors. Land availability is another problem. Singapore imports almost all of its vegetables because it's got a very small physical land footprint. There are certain crops like mushrooms that must be grown indoors, or at least the commercial mushrooms. There are places where it's appropriate or where it's necessary. In Iran, most of the cucumbers, very popular crop there, are grown in greenhouses in the winter because it's too hot in the summer to do any agriculture. So they grow the cucumbers in winter, but they shelter them in greenhouses for, again, to extend the season, to protect them. So it's necessary in certain areas. There are facilities that have been built in the Arctic so that Inuit people can have foods. But the main issue is that it's done in just remarkable scales in the West. You asked about some of the findings. We found that in this analysis of all these other studies that the energy use per, let's say, kilogram of tomatoes or per kilogram of lettuce or pick your crop can be up to 10,000 times more than the energy for open field agriculture. So open field agriculture is tractors, pumps to run irrigation, things of that sort. In the indoor facilities that we've been talking about, there are electric lights, there's air conditioning, there's dehumidification, there's space heating and other kind of ancillary uses, and it's just remarkable. We saw of how much energy is used, and the most intensive crop turned out to be cannabis, and that was the crop I initially started to study because I had moved out to rural California, and I was in nurseries buying stuff for my vegetable garden, and I saw behind the counter these 1,000-watt electric light bulbs. So 1,000 watt is probably more energy than the little space heater you might have under your desk. It's the size of a large space heater for a living room. It was mind-boggling. I'm an energy guy, so I was seeing these devices, and these light bulbs are a foot long. So I started asking the proprietor, what is this? I was ignorant. And, he winked and he nodded, and, this is for growing cannabis indoors. And so I started chasing that originally as an energy analyst, and I found out that nationally, cannabis alone was emitting as much greenhouse gas emissions from the electricity to run the lights, to run the air conditioning, as about 6 million cars, about 10 million homes, that one crop. And it turns out to be the most energy intensive of crops. No one had ever looked at comparing that crop to its energy use to other food crops. And so this is the first paper that does that to try to see, does cannabis uniquely problematic in that way? And you would kind of think it was for various reasons, but it turns out that a number of other crops will use not as much, but half as much cannabis, which means it's 5,000 times more than outdoor instead of 10,000, but still tremendous amount of energy for all these other crops.
Your studies are quite detailed. You're a scientist. You read the data. The articles are very well referenced. Charts can be a little tough for the average person. They're for the scientists, but you do have great summaries that anybody can understand. Like in the article, you're referencing the emergence of indoor agriculture as a driver of global energy demand. Perhaps you could explain one paragraph to me where your article assembles a meta-analysis of available CEA, which stands for Controlled Environment Agriculture, and the energy use data, and that the studies adopt a wide variety of system boundaries, which, for example, cradle to farm gate, cradle to grave, with corresponding life cycle assessment approaches. Talk to us in our language.
Yeah. You could think of like the world of accounting, like you have a business and what are your income and your expenses and trying to understand all these flows of money. I'm kind of an energy accountant, so I'm following the BTUs, I'm following the carbon. So when you want to study something, it's that this idea of a boundary condition is important. Where do you start and stop counting? Like here's a lamp here on the desk near where we're sitting, and are you counting the energy going into that light fixture, or are you also counting the energy in the coal that might be 100 miles from here that's going into the power plant? Are you counting the energy to mine that coal? So that's the system boundary idea. And these studies, unfortunately, they're kind of not coordinated. They're not uniform in what energy they are and aren't counting. In these farms, you've got the energy being consumed. Sometimes it's electricity only. Sometimes it might be oil and gas. Also, some of these farms in Europe use coal to heat these buildings at night. So part of the system boundary is which energy uses are and aren't you counting? Are you counting the vehicles that are bringing fertilizer? Are you counting the processing equipment? Are you counting the freezers that might be there? So that my effort was just to get as uniform as possible so we can compare one to another. If you don't have this common system boundary, you're comparing apples and oranges. So that's part of the challenge.
When you're comparing different kinds of crops, how they're raised, indoors, outdoors, does it make a difference if they're using modern mechanized equipment, if they're using pesticides, herbicides, or if they're going organic and using permaculture? I would assume that the latter is healthier and less energy consumptive?
Yes and no. I mean, the focus here, any environmental problems has all kinds of dimensions. So here I'm focusing on energy, and the environmental issues around pesticides or water efficiency are other than energy primarily. So this paper isn't pretending to look at the trade-offs between organic and non-organic in terms of chemicals in the world, except the energy to make those chemicals. So this does include the energy to make the fertilizers and pesticides, and also transportation. Like one of the big arguments for indoor agriculture that's made by the investors, by the industry, is that you solve the problem of food deserts and you bring the food closer to where people are and you have fewer trucks driving around. And it all sounds very nice and very lovely. And so let's have these factory farms on the roof of the market, and you bring the food down the elevator right to the shelf and you save all those trucking. And so part of what I was doing was to look at that. Is that really a valid set of arguments? Is that really true? And so again, back to the system boundary, that we looked here at the transportation energy versus the facility energy. And back to your question, we looked at the energy to make the fertilizers, to make the artificial growing media. And it turns out that really it's the energy, the direct energy that's used by the lights, by the heating and the cooling. That's the elephant in the room. The energy used by these other things, of course, it's all important, but the real problem with indoor agriculture is its energy use. And there isn't really an idea of organic for indoor agriculture because these factory farms, these very industrialized ones, everything's liquefied. They have precision little spaghetti lines that go right to the plant and put the water, measure every drop, trying to be water efficient, by the way. We can come back to that because that does have an energy aspect. But they mix liquid fertilizers in with that water. They call it fertigation, and that's not compost. So the indoor agriculture is also very synthetic. And like I mentioned, the soil is not soil. It's actually spun mineral wool. Like you can think of almost like steel wool at your kitchen counter. And that's awful. It's made by melting rock, typically with coal. So there's what we call embodied energy that is wrapped up, pardon the pun, in this spun growing media that should be counted. It is counted, but it's like 5 5 or 10% of the whole carbon footprint, energy use / carbon footprint. It's that lighting, it's that cooling, it's that heating. That's the big problem. There is kind of a subtext here about sustainability, that a lot of the argument for indoor ag is that it's sustainable, that it uses less water because you don't have the same evaporation because you're in a room, and it uses less land, and it uses less energy because you're not trucking. But in reality, the carbon footprint of indoor ag is way higher than the carbon footprint of outdoor, especially if you do outdoor in a smart way. Indoor is very optimized. It's got decades of all this R&D and gear and equipment, like you said, a lot of high tech. And outdoor is chosen shovels and tractors, and it hasn't changed as much in the last 100 years, let alone 10,000. There's a kind of cognitive dissonance here that a lot of the branding, a lot of the advocacy for indoor is around sustainability. But really, if you look at it, I mentioned water. I think it's worth a second, if you'd like, on the water side. So yes, it's true that you have less evaporation of water, but guess what? To make electricity takes an enormous amount of water because you're cooling the power plants, the big hourglass water cooling towers, or hydroelectric, sadly, which is a renewable technology. There's enormous evaporation. So if you count that water, indoor ag uses way more water than outdoor cultivation. System boundary, if you don't think about that broader implication of the energy use for water, and just quickly on the land use. So the idea of indoor ag is that you get more than one crop a year. You get 2, 3, actually the cannabis growers can get up to 7 or 8 crops a year. And so, wow, it sounds like I'm going to have a much smaller footprint on the environment because I'm using an eighth of the land to get my yield because I'm getting 8 times per year. But let's say we care about climate change and we want to have no carbon footprint. That means all that electricity can't come off of a dirty grid. It's going to come off of solar or wind. Well, how much land does that take? And guess what? It's like it could be 100, 200, 300 times as much land area as outdoor growing, just using the sun directly. So that was one of the real surprises that came out of this, and that analysis hadn't really been done before. And it's just another way that sustainability is not achieved in the way that the industry would like us to feel that it is achieved with these new methods.
This is why we need scientists like you to really analyze, critique what is going on at all aspects. And we're going to talk more about energy use in agriculture with my guest, Evan Mills, when we return in a moment.
Environmental Directions with Nancy Perlman continues with further discussion of the world's critical ecological issues. For more information, you may call 310-559-9160 or go to www.ecoprojects.org. Now, here's Nancy.
I'm speaking with Evan Mills, who is a retired senior scientist with the United States Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, which is a research affiliate with the Energy and Resources Group at the College of Natural Resources at the University of California at Berkeley. We've been talking about agriculture and its energy use, but you have also studied and taught about green building and pioneering projects and how energy is used in data centers, in laboratories, indoor agriculture, which we've been talking about, high-tech facilities, energy use in computer gaming, federal energy management, real estate appraisals for green buildings, energy and low-income housing, utilization of the internet for disseminating energy information and tools, energy access in the developing world, energy planning and policy more broadly. We talked about that years ago when you were on the program. Perhaps you ought to give us an update. You founded the Home Energy Saver Project, a do-it-yourself web-based energy audit. How does that work?
The Home Energy Saver? Well, that's a whole long story. So it's no longer online because of changing priorities among the sponsors, let's say.
But you did have 10 million users at one time.
We did. It was a fabulous project. There were computer programs developed in the 70s and 80s that very marvelously, very accurately would predict energy use in a home, and you've got your windows and you've got how thick your insulation is and what kind of heating, but very few people were qualified to use those tools. They required a big computer. And so starting back in the 90s, there was this new thing coming out called the internet. The idea was, how do we make a web page where a homeowner could come and describe their house and get a carbon footprint back that was really theirs, really tailored to their building and also their lifestyle. Where do you keep your thermostat set? How much do you cook at home? All these things, behavior affects energy. So we carried that off, almost a 20-year-long project, and we had a very accurate, super accurate, flexible tool that would not just figure out how much energy was was used in your home and what the corresponding carbon emissions were, but also what could you do to modify the home. So it would give a set of recommendations if you went from single windows to double windows, if you went from a gas furnace to a heat pump, if you went from a regular fridge to an Energy Star fridge, if you went from incandescent lights to LED lights.
In other words, in our homes, in our offices, in our buildings, we can be energy more efficient.
It's very important. People feel, especially these days, so disempowered to do anything about climate and energy problems. You'd be amazed how important we call the built environment is to the carbon footprint. Globally, buildings, that means our homes and our workplaces, are responsible for 40% of all energy-related greenhouse gas emissions from human activity. So that's industry, transport, agriculture, and homes and offices. 40% of that is homes and offices. And so what determines the carbon footprint of a building? Well, it's the architect, it's the builder, but it's the occupant also. Very important. Which fridge do you buy? Which clothes washer do you buy? When you're modernizing, do you change the windows? Do you put in a heat pump? And so my point is, in these times of wondering what to do and blaming the dirty industries and so on, we need to remember that as occupants of buildings, in the workplace too, in the workplace we have agency, especially if you're a senior person, over the equipment, over the practices, over whether the lights get turned off at night, and certainly remodeling and renovation, but also a worker. Do you shut down your laptop when you go to lunch? No one of these things is a silver bullet, but in aggregate, they're 40% of society's carbon footprint from energy. So the built environment's super important.
And the individual does have a role, but then we also have to change governmental policy. We have to consider what kinds of programs nations should have. You've been a visiting researcher at Lund University in Sweden, so you saw another country work on these issues. You worked for over 4 decades under the auspices of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and collectively they shared the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. I think it's so important that we continue with doing something here in the United States. I am appalled that the United States refused to send a delegation to the International Conference on Climate Change that was recently held in Brazil. You have worked internationally. You have done the studies because you have been involved with over 377 published articles, contributions to 17 books, 86 peer-reviewed journal articles. You've been a speaker in 21 countries, so you see the broader picture. What should the United States be doing, and how did this intergovernmental panel's research and report affect changes in governments, and how is it relevant now?
I can start from the last question and work backwards. So first of all, I wasn't involved for 40 years with IPCC. That's my full career, but very long time. The IPCC is a remarkable, important entity, specifically in the respect you just were alluding to. What it is a consortium of scientists from all over the planet. Basically, every country is represented. And what they do is a synthesis of the scientific literature on about a 5-year scale. So they're, I think, on their 6th round now. The idea there is that it's policy relevant. So the synthesis is by scientists, but it's for policymakers. So it's taking the arcane, all this jargon that we're running into here with indoor ag, and it's everywhere, taking that and really bringing it back to actionable, understandable assessment, again, policymakers can use. And what's our certainty? What do we know? What don't we know? Where does the research need to happen? What are the potential costs in both human life and welfare and health, as well as economically, of climate change? How does it affect different industries? My role in IPCC primarily was to look at the effect of climate change on the insurance and the banking industries, which was really, really fascinating. Insurance is kind of the canary in the coal mine. And so I guess to say also that IPCC is also commercially relevant, or relevant to industry, not just to policymakers. Insurance is the largest industry in the world. I think their premiums volume now is 5 or 6 trillion with a T dollars per year. And who's more sensitive to climate change, right? Insurers are paying for hurricanes, for wildfires, for floods, health effects of heat stress, of bad water. It's been for a long time, since the 70s, a very thoughtful industry, especially the European arms of the insurance industry, but also Asia, on we need to understand climate change. We need to model its effects on losses, on our payouts, and then what can we do to be proactive? How can we incentivize as an industry? The interest here is in government and public sector, and there is a role there too of insurance working with the public sector. These are things we talked about in the IPCC reports, that insurers can incentivize penalize resilience. Let's say you have a less flood-prone property. So you shouldn't pay as much insurance for flood if you have a less flood-prone property. But insurers don't build levees, right? That's the public sector. Insurers don't do zoning. They don't say, don't build so close to the riverbank. That's up to the public sector. So there is a lot of dynamic between private industry and government in that particular example, that insurers become important. They're stakeholders to interact with the public sector on things like land use planning, on building codes, right? Fire resilience in building codes. It was a very kind of virtuous circle in the sense of here's the market saying, hey, climate change is affecting the economy. This isn't just about butterflies or about tree hugging. It's also about solvency of businesses. And can banks loan money on houses that are in high fire risk? Because the house is the collateral, right? So private business is vulnerable, and therefore the economy is vulnerable to climate change. And insurers have been an important messenger of that to governments and say, you governments, you need to work with us. You need to help with resilience so that we can continue to function and be part of the broader economy. IPCC looks at the atmospheric chemistry. They'll look at the basics of climate change and how are temperatures changing and how's the ice responding and all of that. They have a whole group that does that, and they have a whole group that looks at the impacts, kind of what I've been talking about, extreme weather and so on. And then there's a third group within IPCC that looks at solutions. So what's going on with renewable energy? What's going on with energy efficiency? What are the best practices? What's working? What's not working? What's the potential? How much can we reduce emissions? Because policymakers need to know that. Policymakers can't act without data, without analysis. So within IPCC and within our field more broadly, we do scenarios and we look at different countries, different regions, different sectors, agriculture, tourism. How much carbon footprint is there today? How can it be reduced? How much will it cost? Where should we start? What are the risks? It's a very interdisciplinary mishigas.
There was absolutely no question for the last few decades from scientists, environmentalists, and anybody who sees what's going on our planet Earth with extinction and ecosystem destruction that climate change is having a major impact. What is your response to those who still call it a hoax or non-existent?
I'm not being patronizing here, but in part I feel sorry. It depends where they're coming from when they say that. A certain group of people truly believe that, and they're the ones that I feel sorry for because they've been manipulated in the scientific sense. They've been induced to believe things that are not factual, and it becomes, of course, tribal and political and conflated with ideological things as distinct from factual-based things. And so that's one set of reactions. The other is that it's often a symptom of a deeper problem. It's not that they believe different science or they're healthy skeptics, but they're things like there's a big movement for end times these days and the rapture, and that there's a large percentage of the population that believes that this needs to end and the good people need to rise up and the bad people need to sink down. And the last thing we would do is stop climate change, because climate change is ushering in these changes. So there's that. It depends. There's a lot of different reasons, I think, for skepticism, or a lot of things behind the skepticism, and they're what needs to be addressed. But I think we have a big problem with education, with scientific literacy. So young people coming up don't learn well enough to think critically, to think for themselves, to ask probing questions, to scrutinize their sources. These basic kind of habits of mind as a consumer, as a citizen, to consume information, to consume the opinions of other people carefully and really come to your own conclusion that's informed by something. And so I think that's part of the problem that we have right now with anti-science. There's a war on science, and it's not just climate, it's health, obviously. There's a hostility towards science and towards expertise more broadly. And we say to people, like, if you have a brain tumor, are you going to go to a podiatrist or a car mechanic? Really?
The doomsday clock is really close to midnight. Can we turn things around?
Honestly, I'm more cynical than I've ever been. I generally am an optimist. I'm a technologist. I believe in technology applied correctly, but there's just as large of a human component to that. The future is something that's chosen. It's not something that happens to us. And so society, whatever it is, where housing development's going to happen, what medicines we chase, what energy sources we use, those are decisions. And we have to make those decisions. What hasn't changed is that we have all the technology. There's plenty of technology to reduce carbon emissions basically to zero from human activity in an economical way, in a cost-effective way, in a way that will leave society with more money in its pocket, more comfortable housing, safer cars, less waste, on and on. So the problem is a social and political one of having the will, having the organization. There's a lot of organization needed. It's complicated. Kermit was right. It's not easy being green.
I'm so pleased that you have done such incredible scientific research that helps us environmentalists, policymakers to make the right decision to try and save this planet from environmental destruction, from climate change. And I'm pleased that you continue your interest and your work in this area. It is really helpful to all of us. And thank you for explaining it to us on Environmental Directions. I hope that you'll come back and give us more updates because there's so much that we can learn from all of your research. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you for being my guest.
Pleasure, Nancy. Great to see you today.
I have been speaking with Evan Mills, who is a retired senior scientist with the United States Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, research affiliate with the Energy and Resources Group at the College of Natural Resources at the University of California at Berkeley. And he is also a principal of the group Energy Associates. I'm Nancy Perlman. Thank you very much for joining us, and do tune in again next week.
If you would like free information about these environmental issues, go to www.ecoprojects.org or call 310-559-9160. Environmental Directions with your host, Nancy Perlman, is a community affairs program of the nonprofit organization Educational Communications and this station.